Over the past 4 years, the Silurians have hosted a series of writers willing to take a swing or two at Donald J. Trump. They included David K. Johnston, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, Tony Schwartz, Gabe Sherman. Today, we host a guest who has observed the president's often erratic behavior more closely than any reporter out there. Maggie Haberman's tireless coverage of Trump's antics inspired the Times media critic Ben Smith to write a long column praising her work. Smith wrote, and I quote him, "Haberman has been, for the last 4 years, the source of a remarkably large share of what we know about Donald Trump and his White House, from the Mueller investigation to his personal battle with the coronavirus to his refusal to accept defeat. She's done more than a story a day, on average, and stories with her byline have accounted for hundreds of millions of page views this year alone. That's more than anyone else at the Times." Haberman was particularly well suited for this journalistic moment because of her sheer relentlessness and hunger and her lack of smug self-satisfaction. She seems to need to prove herself every day. She texts while she drives, talks while she eats, parents while she reports, tweets and regrets it. Doom scrolls. I don't know what doom scrolls is, but I'm glad to know that you do it, Maggie. 4 years ago, we enjoyed a conversation between Maggie and her father about the beginnings of the Trump regime. Now we are pleased they have agreed to reprise that conversation as the Trump era comes to an end. They've agreed to take questions. Please post them in the chat section of your Zoom, and I will relay them to our speakers. Maggie and Clyde, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. It was great for a parent again to hear that she's texting while she's driving, but okay.
Not anymore.
That's fine.
Not anymore.
Okay, good. Good to know. So we did this nearly 4 years ago, Maggie, and what have you been up to? Anyway, look, can you give us a read on what Trump strategy, if there is such a thing that could be called strategy, what it is now? Is he just simply flailing, incapable of accepting defeat? Before we began this formal part of the talk, you had said that he will accept it. Will he? I mean, to ask Dominic Carter's question on New York One all the time, what's going on? It's a little hard to read as to whether or not we're dealing with a madman or a real strategist.
I mean, it's never been a real strategy. That's been, first of all, thank you for attending, and thank you for having us again. It has never been a real strategy. What he is having, I would say, is a series of negotiations with himself, with the Republican Party, with senators, with his broader base, that leaves him as many options open as possible. And he is, when you say, is he going to accept it? That's actually a different statement, I think, than what I said, which is that he'll leave. I said he'll leave the White House, which he will. But whether he's going to ever accept that he lost and say, yes, I lost. He said, he has said different things to different people. At times he has made clear that he knows it's over. At other times he is talking about Dominion voting machines and don't people think that this was stolen from him. I think he will leave the White House. I think he will just keep saying this was rigged, in his word, on his way out the door. But I think he is trying to leave himself as many pathways open as possible. I do think he'll say he's running again. Whether he does or doesn't is an open question. But I do think that that's likely.
I think most people probably in this conversation, and maybe most Americans, feel that to some degree they're now undermining our democratic processes. To the degree that this is true, and I do believe it's true, does this weigh on any of the people in his orbit? Is there any concern among them that it's not just Donald Trump's future or immediate present that's important for the country, but our very democracy. Is this on anybody's minds who's, again, in his orbit?
I think there are certainly people who are aware that it is undermining institutions. I don't think that is their primary concern. I think their primary concern is whether it is hurting their own chances of getting a job after he leaves, and that is something I do hear a fair amount. But I don't think that there's a tremendous amount of attention being paid to the lasting damage that this is doing to institutions.
That's not encouraging.
Well, I mean, it's again, my take on this is that he's going to continue doing this for the next 60 days. And so I think that with that in mind, I think that Democrats, while acknowledging that what he's doing is denying a peaceful transition, but I think Democrats are then faced with a choice, which is either wait and see what he's going to do. I think Biden has tried very hard to take the temperature down, or they can recognize that this is what he's going to do and try to work around that. One of the things I will say is that one of the not dangerous, but one of the harder parts of covering the last 4 years has been Trump's critics wanting us to confirm their worst anxieties about Trump, that believing that because they believe Trump could send ICE agents into the street on election day, that therefore we should cover it as if he is doing that right now. He's not. I think that what he is doing is damaging enough. But what he's going to do is try to box Biden in on policy, and they're making it very clear what they're doing. They're going to sign a bunch of EOs on China. He's going to draw down troops in Afghanistan, which is, hugely contentious, obviously, and has its own significant ramifications. But I guess I'm not sure what people are hoping would be encouraging. I think he's going to leave, right? But short of that, I think he is going to leave very, very ugly. And I don't expect it to change from where it is now.
Do you think he would actually concede or just walk away?
I think he will walk away. I think the race will get certified for Joe Biden at some point. Some of his allies, not all of them, but some of his allies are trying very hard to keep that from happening, most notably Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon. And assuming that it does get certified, which I assume it will, then I think that it's over. There's no longer the fig leaf of could it be thrown into the House of Representatives, but he'll continue saying it was stolen from him and he'll just walk away. But at that point, a transition, it would be impossible for the General Services Administration administrator, a woman named Emily Murphy, who's a Trump appointee, to continue saying, I haven't been able to give an ascertainment yet of who won. Once the election is certified, that's it.
Use of the word certified also reminds me of the word certifiable, and you mentioned Giuliani. So let me turn to him. Nearly a year ago, I wrote a piece for Politico, which was asked to answer the question of what is going on with Rudy Giuliani? Mr. 9/11, blah, blah, blah. What has happened to him? My basic thesis was nothing's happened to him. He was still the same nasty fellow I was, who we all knew in New York. Whatever one may think of some of his policies that made the city better, he's nonetheless a very, very, to be very polite, difficult man. But this does seem qualitatively worse and crazier. And all this stuff in the last few weeks and months, from the Borat business to his press conference, leaving aside the issue that it wasn't exactly the Four Seasons Hotel that he was had this press conference in the other week. But standing right behind him was a convicted sex offender and another ex-con named Bernie Kerik. And I guess it's my what's going on question. He does seem more addled than I remember. Is he just simply a drowning man desperate for attention?
Yeah, I think desperate for attention, relevance. I think he's desperate to show that he was right about Hunter Biden, which has led him down very destructive paths. I think that it is somewhat personal for him with Biden. Remember, it was Joe Biden, who coined the mocking of
Right.
of Rudy as, relying solely on a noun, a verb, and 9/11 during one of the primary debates in 2007. I think that Giuliani has never been without a stage, and he has been for the last couple of years. And Donald Trump has provided him with a stage. So, if you think about it, he was U.S. attorney, and then he was mayor for 8 years, and then he was America's mayor for another 8 years before his disastrous presidential campaign. And then he spent a couple of years wandering in the irrelevant wilderness, and he didn't like it. So I think that he is. There is a shock jock nature to this, but you do hit on something that I think people who didn't deal with him in New York City miss, which is, in the same way that the whole America's mayor thing branded him nationally to people who didn't know him as mayor, Donald Trump was branded nationally to people through The Apprentice, which is very different than how we knew him in New York City and know him in New York City. This version of Rudy has always been there. It's just that it was always countervailed by a policy wonk who was extremely smart. And now he's just willing to say anything, and it's impossible to tell whether he believes it or doesn't believe it.
And his appeal to Trump is what exactly? It is my sense that actually Giuliani is not a particularly good lawyer. Even when he was U.S. attorney, he lost a whole bunch of cases, or arrests that he made were done more for the TV cameras and not for their jurisprudence value. And he seems to me to be losing again and again and again. So why doesn't Trump get himself a real good lawyer?
Because no real lawyer wants to work for Trump, and this has been the case for the last 3 years. I mean, go back to the Mueller investigation. Most major law firms did not want to work with him. A bunch of folks came in and met with him in the Oval Office, and I think they came away kind of freaked out. So this is what he has. And Giuliani is working at opposite purposes to what most people around Trump, among his political advisors and even in the White House, want. But Trump, you remember, the thing with Trump is always this line that he said to James Comey, or actually, no, I don't think it was to James Comey. I don't remember if it was to Comey or somebody else, but it was, "Where's my Roy Cohn?"
Right.
Like, that's what he wants. And Giuliani is willing to play his Roy Cohn right now. But there are no lawyers who don't want to face sanctions are going to go ahead and do what Trump wants. Ultimately, Trump is somebody who has never met a problem that he didn't think he could sue his way out of. And that's what he's doing right now. But you can't sue your way out of an election. So,
do you have a sense of how fearful, if at all, the various Trumps, starting with the president, but including his family, are of various criminal investigations that are either underway or will be underway? And
they're very fearful of it. I mean, the president has talked about this with a number of people. My colleague, our colleague Alex Burns, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. But the president has in unguarded moments with a number of advisors said he's worried not just that they're going to go after him, federal prosecutors, but go after his family. There are already 2 active investigations. One is civil from the Attorney General in New York, which relates to the Trump Foundation. That will be some kind of a penalty, but that does involve going after his children because their names are signatories on some of these expenditures. And then there's an investigation by Cy Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney, who's been trying to get Trump's taxes for a very long time. Trump's very annoyed by the existence of both investigations. He is more worried about what the Southern District of New York could do. Because remember, they're the ones who went after Michael Cohen in the first place.
Right. But I think theoretically, probably his attorney general could shut that down to some degree before he leaves, but he can't stop the state investigations, be they from Letitia James up in Albany or
right. Or Vance.
Here.
No, the only way that you could do that, and again, this is a theoretical, would be if somebody was trying to negotiate a global settlement for Trump. I think there was something similar that was negotiated for Clinton when he left office, and there were still legal questions facing him. I think that I don't know what Vance's willingness would be to go along with that. I'd be very surprised if Tish James was willing to go along with that. She's ambitious, and she I think takes the attacks on her very personally, understandably. I think that Joe Biden, there was an interesting piece yesterday that NBC.com did about Biden not really having an appetite for prosecuting his predecessor. And boy, if anything was a smoke signal that was aimed at letting a guy know that it's safe to leave the house, in this case, the White House, I took that story as it. I think that there are some efforts to signal to Trump, we're not going to prosecute you endlessly. And frankly, I mean, Joe Biden, whose entire case has been a return to normalcy, I think was always going to have huge internal conflicts about, just within himself, about prosecuting or investigating his predecessor. But the sitting president is very concerned about it.
Right. Those of us old enough to remember Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, there was great controversy over that. I happen to fall in the camp that Ford did the right thing, and to have some sort of national healing. But a lot of people really wanted to see Nixon stand in the dock, and it was very controversial. And I would assume that so would any prosecution or non-prosecution of Trump would create similar tensions within the populace, no?
I think that that's correct. I mean, look, I think I think a pardon will create, I think any of these actions is going to create enormous blowback. I think if there's a pardon of Trump, it is going to enrage people who voted against him, and even some who didn't. I don't know what this would look like. Does Trump step down? And I don't think Biden's going to pardon him, but does Trump step down so that Pence can pardon him? Does he try pardoning himself? These are questions that we've been asking among ourselves in the Washington Bureau. But then there's the question of, on the flip side, again, getting back to the Biden piece of this, Trump did get so far 73 million votes. It will end up being more than that. That's 10 million more than he got last time. So it's not just, stasis. This election, while decisive and 306 electoral votes, Trump was willing to call it a landslide about himself. But what the popular vote results were not the decisive repudiation of Trumpism that Democrats were hoping for. And so it's an enormously treacherous time going forward. And I don't know what the right answer is or the good answer is on either option.
We are a journalism group, so let me ask a couple of journalism questions. I don't know to what degree you can be completely forthright on some of them, but the first one would inevitably be your own relationship with Trump. You've obviously had many interviews with him over the years. He has also hurled insults at you. It's always great for a parent to hear, and I'm sure for you to hear and for your children to hear. But can you discuss at all how accessible he has been to you, or maybe remains to you? I mean, you do have extraordinary stories, so presumably you are talking to some people.
I am talking to some people, but I would never say who those people are, whether it was him or somebody else. And because we are a journalism group, I assume this group would understand that.
Yeah. Okay. You just signed a book deal, and could you give a general sense of what direction it will take? There have obviously been a lot of Donald Trump books.
We announced it last week, but I've actually had the deal for a little bit. I wanted to wait until the end of the election to announce it, but I just because I didn't want anyone thinking that my coverage was intended toward an outcome one way or the other. But I'm the only reporter who covers him in the White House who also covered him before he was before he was a campaigner. And a lot of what he does in the White House is predicated on this swamp of New York City that he came out of, which was this fairly corrupt New York City political machine, a deeply transactional relationship with the New York press, and mostly the New York Post. And so I'm going to try to bridge the two worlds, because I think that a lot of people have, part of what confuses people who cover him and people who are around him in Washington is they've sort of never seen someone like him. But if you cover City Hall in New York, you actually understand him somewhat well. So that's what I'm aiming to do. And a lot of it is going to draw, not a lot of it, but some of it's going to draw on the work that Wayne Barrett did. Wayne was one of my role models, and spent a lot of time emailing me in 2016 when Trump was running. Wayne also took me out to console me after my first ever TV appearance, which was on New York One in '99, and it was absolutely disastrous. And so he took me out to coffee afterwards to try to cheer me up. So it's going to be different than the Trump books that people have seen so far. And I hope there will still be an appetite for it in a year. I think there will be, because I think we'll be writing about this period of time for decades to come. But that's it.
Your coverage has obviously brought you a ton of praise, but also a fair amount of attacks from both the left and the right, much of it grossly unfair. And I say that as a journalist, really, not as a father. Nonetheless, are there stories you did that you, in retrospect, or maybe even right away, regret? Things that you wish you hadn't done, or things that you didn't do that you wish you had, and also on the positive side, what were some of your finest moments in your evaluation?
It's a great question, and it's probably a question that I can give a better answer to in 6 months when I've had more sleep and have been able to reflect back on the coverage. Just because it's been so nonstop that it's hard for me to even look back there. I mean, there are a couple of stories that I can point to two stories. One that I was assigned, and one that I was not. One was during the White House. One was not. In general, I'm overall proud of my White House coverage. I can't think of a story that I did where I think I wish that we had done differently on that story. There are a million headlines that I wish had been written differently, and that's the perennial problem of a print reporter. But it's also something that, knowing that we need to, as reporters, take an active role in trying to make the headline, tell editors that the headline needs to be more reflective of what's in the story.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do they run headlines by you before?
We now can see them in the system. We can see them in the system, and I have, over the last year, become more vocal about, that headline is going to become fodder for a Twitter attack. Can we redo X, Y, Z? I've just gotten much more vocal about it than I ever was at any point in my career. When I was at the New York Post for a collective 10 years, you spent most of your days ducking under your desk because of the headlines. So this is a little different. There's two stories that I can point to, and one was about Hope Hicks that I was assigned to do. That was just a predictable debacle.
You took a lot of flack for that, yeah.
What's that?
You took a lot of flack on that.
Yeah, and it was, as I said, it was an assignment. People who are there are without getting into the reasons why I was assigned, there are criminologists of the New York Times and self-appointed media critics on Twitter who have decided they know exactly the motive of why any story takes place, and they were all wrong. This was an assignment, but it was not something that I could speak up about. But that was a perfect storm of disaster. It was a bad headline. It was a bad photo. I understand why people thought it was a questionable story topic. It was a case where I think the Times has been slow to recognize the power of Twitter. And generally we treat social media as just this sort of extraneous thing, which is a problem when we have told readers that Twitter is the new public editor. So what has ended up happening is Twitter readers users have taken that very literally. And they act as our public editors in pretty personal terms sometimes. The other one, and I don't regret the story, I do regret how it ended up, and I regret a significant piece that was missing that should have been very high up, which was about Trump on LGBT issues during the 2016 campaign. He had a history of, he's not particularly animated by LGBT issues personally. It's actually, LGBT folks are among the few that you don't hear him personally demonize, if you think about it. And yet his policies in office have been incredibly aggressive against the LGBTQ community, including rolling back a lot of what Obama did and using transgender policy as a wedge issue with the LGBT community, which there's a long history of doing, but he has just taken that up happily. But there was a story I did during the campaign that I wish had had much more context about how it was totally unclear what any of his history meant for policy, because he's got no strong political core or policy core internally. But in general, I think that we did the best we could have covering a pretty extraordinary 4 years. The only overall regret that I have, but I don't think that about coverage, this is really about Mueller coverage, is I think that there was this sense of from the Mueller coverage that it was all building towards something. And so I think that readers ended up with this expectation, and we never said this, but I understand why they thought it, that he was going to get like frog marched out of the Oval Office. And it was pretty clear that was not going to happen by late 2018. And I think that we could have done a better job, all of us, making that clear.
I see, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael, because I see there are a lot of questions, but your mention of Obama reminded me of something that, my last question, if I may, for now, about Obama, it occurred to me last night, to what degree is Obama's media tour, as he plugs his book, and his book has gotten, from the reviews I've seen, terrific reviews. Yep. To what degree is this confluence causing Trump to dig in even further and hunker down in the White House? Obviously, he is driven bonkers by Obama and has been for many years. Does Obama's sudden reemergence play a role in this, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure that he doesn't enjoy the TV segments about it, but as much coverage as it's gotten, and it has gotten favorable coverage, A, he's not going to read the book, and B, I don't think it's been a dominant story in the media he consumes, which is television.
Fair enough. Michael, shall I turn it to you?
Thank you, Clyde. We'll start with this one from Lynn Abraham. Has Trump mentally and emotionally checked out as being president? If so, in your view, who is running the country? He is playing a lot of golf.
Well, he's not playing any more golf than he normally does, actually. He's gone golfing. He's gone golfing both weekend days for most of his presidency. And so that's what he's been doing here. He certainly has checked out on the coronavirus. There are parts of his job that he is doing, among them, I think I mentioned this before, but EOs related to China, Afghanistan troop withdrawal. There are certain big ticket items that he's focusing on, but in general, he's much more engaged in calling friends and talking about whether the Dominion voting machines really did flip votes against him. The coronavirus has been something that he has treated as if it was a scam against him, basically since February. And it is the most alarming piece to me of this transition delay, is not just the national security implications, which are real, but also any delay that could be problematic on vaccine distribution or therapeutic development for treating the coronavirus. That's a huge issue. And the fact that the president of the United States is just acting as if it doesn't exist. It's funny, he made a huge thing about how after November 3rd, no one's going to talk about it anymore. Everyone's talking about it. He's just not talking about it. And he is spending a lot more time in the Oval Office than he normally does. That is a big difference. And that I attribute to, he knows realistically that it's ending, and he's just trying to soak up as much being there as he can.
Evelyn Reynolds asks, the drawdown from Afghanistan and the threats against Iran, and the apparent discussion that went on of actually military action against Iran, are the people around him going to be able to prevent that? Does that worry people who are watching his last days?
I think that the concern that he is going to have some kind of military engagement with Iran has been deeply concerning to a lot of people, not just the president-elect and his team, but officials in the Mideast and many people in the U.S. Do I think that they can talk him out of it? Maybe. I think that, when he was feeling them out about options last week, he was not, according to our reporting, raring to go and saying, I want to go find a target to strike. He was soliciting views. The views were almost all negative about doing it. Whether that holds is anyone's guess right now. I think it's a mistake to predict what he does. I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the last 4 years has been the disorienting effect he has had on a lot of people. So a lot of people are looking for an answer on any number of topics with him that just doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a journalistic question. How have you been able to develop and maintain your sources inside the administration?
I work really, really hard.
Have people from inside the administration been contacting you with information from the earliest time? Or
I mean, I don't want to get into how I do source development, but there are certainly people who have stopped talking to me. More often than not, people come back. Whenever I will have a conversation with Mike Schmidt, who's been my partner in crime on most of this stuff over the last 4 years, I'll complain about, blah, blah is not talking to me. And he'll say, they all come back. They always come back. And generally speaking, that's true. It's not always true. I've had people who have, completely cut me off. But in general, enough people in this administration have found working there disorienting themselves that they have been interested in talking.
Your father asked how often you've had direct contact with Trump himself.
I'm still not going to answer that question.
Okay. Alan Frank.
And if I didn't answer it for him, I'm definitely not answering it for anyone else.
By the way, I should add that she has not answered it even at family gatherings. So this is a source of endless frustration.
Well, give her a couple of drinks at Thanksgiving, Clyde.
Can I just add though to the previous question about covering him mostly now from New York. Obviously, this deals with telephones and email and the like, but how much more difficult is it? I've never been in a situation where I've been unable to actually physically cover the people.
It's hard. I mean, well, remember, I've been in New York this whole time. I have been to DC 3 or 4 times since March. That's it. And I drive every time because I'm worried, candidly, about the virus and the amount of time it takes to get to the airport or to get to the train. I might as well just drive. It's hard. I mean, there are people who don't want to say things. There was a story we were working on over the summer, and there was a source who didn't want to say stuff over the phone, so I had to go drive down to meet the source, literally for the day, and then I drove back up. So it's been hard. This has not been a great year for anyone.
Right.
Ben Smith mentioned your love-hate relationship with Twitter. Can you expand on that a little bit? He says you went off it for a while. How important is Twitter these days to American journalism?
It's much more important than it should be. The reason that I had to get back on Twitter, candidly, was because the guy I cover is on Twitter, and that's how he does most of his communicating. There's no way to be a White House reporter with Donald Trump and not really be on Twitter. My expectation is we will all be following the president on Twitter much less in the future when Joe Biden comes in. Look, I mean, I think a couple things. I think, and I said this in the piece to him, I've never really mentally adjusted for the fact that I have 1.5 million followers. I still think I'm talking to this small group of people who most of whom know me personally. And then when I start getting attacked, it's by people I don't know or people I know of. It's always a little jarring. I think that Twitter is too important to American journalists now, in the sense that I think a lot of people use it as their AP wire, basically. It's how they get news. And unless you're getting it from the verified accounts of other news outlets, that's risky. People tend to put a lot less energy into their tweet crafting than they do into their story crafting. And there is an ongoing complaint from my executive editor, Dean Baquet, and he's right, which is that something should not belong on Twitter if it doesn't belong in your story. But 90% of our newsroom is tweeting things that would not make it into the New York Times stories. So, and that doesn't mean that they're tweeting about their beat. There's lots of, opining about music or my least favorite genre, complaining about customer service from Delta or something like that. So it has way too much prominence in terms of what any of us do.
You abandoned Twitter on January 21st?
Like I said, I don't think I can completely abandon it, but I don't think I'm going to have to. I don't think I'm going to be getting 20 alerts for the President of the United States on a Saturday morning between the hours of 6:30 a.m. and 9.
As somebody asked what you will do after January 21st, are you going to take time off to write your book, or?
I will at some point, but I don't know when that's going to be, and I don't know exactly what my precise role is going to be next. I anticipate it will be some combination of covering Trump, in whatever new form he takes on, and then covering the new administration, whether that's the White House or not.
Several questions about Trump's children. Will one of them, I assume Don Jr., take the helm of the GOP? Will he pardon them? Although I don't know.
These are very different questions. I think that, so a couple of things. There is a working theory that he's going to pardon his children. I don't know that that's
not out of the blue. So that has been discussed.
Oh yeah, I mean, but this has been being discussed since Mueller.
Who's investigating them?
I'm sorry?
Who's investigating them?
Well, as we said, the Vance investigation relates to his children. The Tish James investigation does not. He could do a preemptive pardon, right? There's some speculation that he could do that with Giuliani, which is part of why Giuliani is making this huge display for him. Part of why Steve Bannon, who is so invested in this, the theory goes, is that Bannon needs a pardon because Bannon's been indicted. So I think there are a range of ways this could go. I don't think Don Jr. is taking over the Republican Party. I think Ronna McDaniel will continue to run the Republican Party. She's who the president wants, and the elected officials who are tied to the Republican Party are terrified of Trump because they're terrified of his voters. So I don't expect that to change. I don't expect Don Jr. runs for office, although I know that that's widely speculated about. I think his sister might. But we have no. I just always want to remind everybody: A, this is not a country that actually really likes dynasties, as we've seen, witness 2016, and B, I mean, the Bushes being an exception and the Adams family being an exception, but I don't. We don't. Everything moves so fast now that if you had asked us in 2013 who's going to be the Republican nominee, Donald Trump would not have been leaping to, off our tongues. So I'm just reluctant to say what any campaign might look like by his children, or if they'd even run one. They could, but I think there's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't.
If not a Trump, who might be the Republican nominee?
You're going to revert back to my answer about predictions. I'm very much out of that game. But look, I do think that Trump is going to be a huge factor in this party for a long time, and I think that's going to heavily impact what it all looks like.
Can I jump in here just with a sidebar question to that? Is Mike Pence helped or hurt by his vice presidency to this president?
I mean, I think that Mike Pence had no other choice as a route to the presidency than to be this person's vice president, but he's not going to be I mean, Alex Burns and I wrote about this several months ago. He's not going to be an heir the way that, Al Gore was, for instance. He will have to duke his way out as the heir of Trumpism, just like any other candidate. So I don't, and if it's a very crowded field, that really doesn't help him. He's not a headline grabber on his own, as we've seen. So And I think that, his main value to Trump was as a validator with evangelical voters. But Trump then forged his own connection to evangelical voters. He didn't really need Mike Pence by the time 2020 rolled around. So what Pence had to offer was unique in 2016. He might be able to sell that for himself again for 2024, but I think he's starting out in the same blocks as everybody else.
And you don't think he has a leg up on the 2024?
I do not. And I don't think Trump's going to do that for him. I think there's nothing about Donald Trump that I know that suggests to me that that's what he's going to do.
I expected and hoped that on November 4th, or at least 5th or 6th, that we would never have to hear anything more about Trump or from him. To what
It's not
extent?
going to happen.
To what extent is this whole thing, a way of keeping his name in the news?
I mean, I think
every day that he can.
I think that he starts out from the prospect that everything is a potential commercial proposition. So I don't think that you can rule that out. I do think it's important to remember that he was president for 4 years. And obviously presidents in this country generally don't have a robust, active post-presidential life over the last couple of decades in the public eye. Bill Clinton would be an exception, but Bill Clinton also had to go through a lot of redemption after he left office. H.W. lost. W had no interest in remaining around Washington. Obama never looked happier than right after he was president and no longer in office anymore. Donald Trump will be very different that way, and he's got 73 million people who supported that. So I want to flip it around a little bit, which is just that so much of the flawed coverage of 2016 was not about Hillary Clinton. It was about people trying to pretend that Donald Trump wasn't the nominee. And then once he was the nominee, that he couldn't win. I think there is a desire to cover the rest of the country as we want it to be, as opposed to what it is. And so he's not going anywhere. And he's got a lot of people who are going to make sure that he gets heard and that they get heard.
Someone asked, is the New York press at fault for not warning the rest of the country about
That's such a ridiculous proposition. Excuse me. I mean, I never respond that way, but the New York press spent an enormous amount of time trying to explain to people the president's real business record. And it didn't matter to a public across the country that had gotten to know him through The Apprentice. The media coverage of this president before, I hate seeing it in terms of positive or negative, but it was filled with negative fact sets for him before he was elected. Voters had every piece of information they needed. People chose to assume he was going to, that the office would change him. I said this to my entire DC bureau, that he is not going to change. I'm telling you what he is. And this was the week after November 8th in 2016. I was diminished, waved off, told I was too tired from a campaign, that I wasn't seeing things clearly. People just didn't want to believe what they were hearing. And there is a real reason. One of the most disappointing aspects of the last 4 years for me has been watching the knee-jerk reflexive, but the media response to everything. How about but the voters? There's one remedy for elections if you don't like the outcome in this country, and it's to vote. And it's to get yourself educated, and it's to be a responsible news consumer. And there are all kinds of people who are doing the exact opposite of that. So no, I think the press has actually done a very, very good job overall.
Mm-hmm. But there's no longer a daily newspaper in a lot of towns in the U.S. The people are relying on less neutral information than used to be available to them.
That is very true. But I still think that I think the death of local news is one of the biggest problems. But there are still news sources that people can get. They're not all free. The Times is subscription, the Journal is behind a paywall, Post is behind a paywall. But there are examples of journalism that you can get where you're going to get an agreed upon fact set as opposed to the choose your own adventure nature of a lot more of the partisan news that exists out there online. It's not a great answer for rural communities where people have less internet access. It is a terrible problem that you're raising, and I don't know what the solution is. But it is certainly part of the problem.
So already Biden is taking a little heat for not being available enough to the press. What's your thinking about that?
I share that view. My concern about the Donald Trump presidency has been, other than what he has done, the kind of norms he has allowed other people to see they can get away with breaking themselves. So there's been a big display by the Biden folks that we're going to restore the press briefings. That's lovely, but maintaining access to the president is important. Answering questions, providing detailed readouts with foreign leader calls is important. Those are really diminished during this presidency. The Obama White House did not have a great track record on freedom of the press, just didn't. And they were very good about saying the right things while investigating reporters and engaging in a lot of leak investigations. So I hope that Biden will do a lot more than what he's doing right now. But I will say, I think they are very brittle about their press coverage. They've received relatively little negative coverage because so much of this year was spent on the coronavirus and on Trump. And I think that it's going to be incumbent upon them to show that they can withstand the heat.
Won't it be inevitable that the coverage will become negative because that there is a built-in adversarial relationship between any government institution and the press?
There are way too many types of conversations going on between one of Joe Biden's press secretaries and reporters who do things they don't like, saying, "You've harmed your entire organization's, relationship with us. Hope this was worth it to you." This is it's typical ref working, but it's pretty disappointing ref working before they're even in office, and especially given what we've just seen. So it will absolutely turn more adversarial. I'm not sure they're prepared for it to turn more adversarial.
Trump got how many, 8 million more votes this time than he got the last time?
I think it's almost 10.
But for the virus, would he have won?
I think that, I don't know if he would have won, but I certainly think it would have been a different race. I have a bit of a different view on it. I think that, the virus was, there were certainly people who were voting about his performance on the virus, but it actually, if you look at the exit polling, and to be clear, I'm very mistrustful of all polling right now, given how all over the map it was before the election. But if we're to believe, at least directionally, what we're seeing in these polls, the exit polls, it was not the driver of voter sentiment the way it appeared to be in the polls going into Election Day. But what it did do was it created a permission structure for Biden to not conduct much of a campaign in person, which for a guy who, yes, I know, these are just gaffes. They're not the same things that the president says, but some of the things that he said were actually pretty problematic, like saying that if you're a Black person and you support Trump, then you ain't Black. That was actually a controversial statement. He is prone to things like that. And so I think that the pandemic created a structure where people were not demanding to see more of him the way they would have otherwise. It obviously highlighted Trump's, disastrous handling of the pandemic, the fact that all the attention was on Trump and Trump never wants the attention to be off of him. And the fact that there was so much by mail voting, I think certainly helped Biden. So in those ways, I think it impacted the outcome. Look, after polls have been pretty clear since 2018 that a majority of people wanted a different president. So I don't know that he would have won without it. I will say that he did increase his turnout margins in rural areas much more than people had expected.
Polls.
Speaking of which.
Speaking of polls,
right.
There was a point in the campaign, I'm reading the newspapers and looking at the TV, and I said to myself, oh my God, the coverage was just dominated by these polls. Again, despite 2016, where you equally horrified?
I don't know if I was, I was horrified. Some of the polls were more right than others. In 2016, it was actually the national polls were right, the state polls were not. And there were modifications made, but then on the other hand, you had, some polls showing Biden up by 7 in Florida. I would argue that pollsters don't really know how to poll Florida for the most part.
He was going to win Ohio and Texas.
Same with, well, Ohio did tighten over what it had been last time. But no, it clearly didn't flip. Ohio clearly didn't flip. I think that, and there were margins that were shown in the 3 Rust Belt states, and the blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that clearly Biden did not reach, right? So, but I do think directionally they got it pretty right. And they clearly captured, at least in those blue wall states, a level of white working class voter support that Biden had that Hillary Clinton did not. So I don't think all is for naught. I think it's complicated.
You've been assigned to write a Trump's weight order obituary. Other than a few obvious blanks, what is your lead?
That's a very Myro question.
See,
I'm going to leave this to the obit writer. I don't write obits.
Well, I do. I've got about 25 advance obits sitting around just waiting for them to kick the bucket. But let me see. How about he's dead? Got it? He's dead. And that'll be it. I don't know. It's an interesting question, Myron, because obviously, do you put the impeachment in the lead? It's not exactly like we've had a ton of presidents who've been impeached, and it's going to be, that would be a very complicated obit to write. I have no idea who, by the way, the New York Times person is who's been assigned to that. I assume there's one ready to go should something happen to him today, but I have no idea when it was last updated.
I don't think it's collecting dust.
Probably not, but it's. But I think the elements would have to be the impeachment, the populism that he represented, the resentment that he articulated and championed. How you cram all that into one sentence is going to be the craft, but it's. I mean, I for one, I don't know about everybody else in this group, but I for one, on occasion, still wake up in disbelief that this man is the president of the United States. So, and obviously has been for the last 4 years. So, it's a complicated presidency, more than most, I would argue. I think I also noticed a question here in the back. Sorry to step on in your territory, Michael, but I see that Ralph Blumenthal is asking, what is that behind you? Not the I Heart New York more than ever.
That was yours, the I Heart New York poster.
Right, it was indeed. But what's the news story?
A story that Mike Schmidt and I did on January 26th was when it posted. This is the Monday paper the day after. About what was in Bolton's book about Ukraine and Trump trying to withhold aid to Ukraine and tying it directly to investigations. It was at a time when Bolton would not comply with the House effort to get him to testify, and the Senate had said they wouldn't call him. And so it's our story, and then he added into the frame. Mike did this for me. The Washington Post story and the Journal story, because they couldn't get hold of it themselves, so they had to credit us in their first 3 graphs, which is pretty rare. So that's it. It's a football spike.
A couple of questions ask whether Trump supporters will gather in Washington to disrupt the inauguration.
They might, but I also wonder whether we're going to have a typical inauguration, given the crowds and given Biden's vulnerabilities, frankly, and given the fact that it will likely be, despite global warming, it will probably be a fairly cold day. Is Biden going to want to stand in the cold for 3 hours? So I think that the COVID restrictions in Washington might make it pretty hard to have a normal inauguration. So sure, I suspect there will be some effort to try to take the day away from him, but I think it will look different regardless.
I'm pretty sure he's familiar with the very short presidency of William Henry Harrison, who caught cold on delivering a long inaugural speech. Didn't survive much more than 40 days, I believe. So
I think his aim is to surpass that.
yeah, I hope so.
Were you surprised that the Democrats did so badly in the House and Senate races? And 2 years from now, could they lose the House?
I was surprised. They certainly, I think it would be, well, I think that these districts are so gerrymandered that I think that it might be hard for them to actually lose it. But I think that Republicans could certainly pick up more seats, given that it'll be a midterm election for the party out of power. Look, I think that you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as down ballot. People were fine voting for the Republican ticket. They just didn't want to vote for Trump as Republicans. I also think that you can look at it that, ironically, despite his interest only in the party as a vehicle for himself, this president has done a fair amount of party building and a fair amount of endorsing of down ballot candidates and fundraising. I think that the Democrats erred and have for a long time in believing that most of the country would reject, in specific areas of the country, would reject a lot of Trump's demagoguery and a lot of the things he says that are racist or sexist or insulting to entire groups of people. People are worried about themselves and their economies and their households and their jobs and their families and their health. And those are the driving issues that they vote on. So I think to the extent that this became about what people perceived as culture, that didn't go well.
People from elsewhere in the country calling up and saying, how are you folks surviving those massive riots that have taken over New York Street? Right. I think maybe part of the reason the Democrats lost is that they believed it. They believed in, that the socialists were taking over, and
I mean, I've heard this argument made a lot. I do think there are certainly House districts where the broad brush of socialism was used against Democrats, and it was harmful. Look, I think that there were weeks of unrest in major cities, and people were watching it, and I think it was unsettling to people, even people who might be sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that the fact that some people took advantage of those protests to engage in unrest was problematic.
I have to ask, as an old New York Post person, albeit pre-Murdoch, but still a tabloid, the inevitable question: does this marriage last?
Between Murdoch and Trump?
Well, there is that. But I was thinking of between Trump and Mrs. Trump.
Oh, that marriage. I have no idea. I mean, I could see a world where she comes and lives in New York while he lives in Florida, and she puts her son back in schools in one of the prep schools here. I could see a world where they stay married forever because she's always known who she was marrying. So I don't know.
This is still a presidency that has to be covered. So if I'm allowed to do the host duties here, thank you, Maggie. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
And so we'll do this again in 4 years.
Exactly. Next year.
You should know, Maggie, this is the best attended Zoom session we've
Excellent.
had. And
I love hearing that. That's great. Thanks to everyone for turning out.
It actually tops most of the in-person luncheons that we normally have.
It's much easier to do this by computer.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming,
Michael.
talking to us.
Great.
All right.